This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a run through the markets. The South African retailer Shoprite has announced that it's basically wrapped up its exit from Nigeria by selling operations there to a group of local investors, Ketron Investments. It seems that investors on the bourse there love the closure of that 16-year run in West Africa. Shares are up by at least 13.4% so far in the year, and they did close at least 1.4% higher. Kenya's corporate bond market has largely been dead, to put it mildly, for a while, but one of Kenya's mid-tier lenders, Family Bank, plans to tap into it to raise $74 million. It plans to raise half of that amount in the first tranche through a multi-currency note. The bank reported a 57.2% rise in net earnings in the first quarter of 2021 at just over $4.3 million. Here's what's coming up tonight. The IMF has announced a $1 billion three-year support package for Uganda, Africa's largest coffee exporter. The volume of mobile money transactions in Tanzania rises to $73 billion. And for the first time since 2018, inflation in the Eurozone has gone up beyond the ECB's target range. We start the hour in a country often referred to as the Pearl of Africa. The International Monetary Fund has agreed to lend $1 billion to Uganda in a three-year program. This is the lender's second bailout to an African nation in less than a week, as the continent's economies continue to struggle to mitigate the economic damage inflicted by the pandemic. On the 27th of May, the IMF agreed to lend $1.5 billion to the Democratic Republic of Congo in another three-year program. Ever since the pandemic hit, the IMF has provided over $15 billion in credit facilities of different kinds to sub-Saharan African nations. The funds in question will help Uganda, which is the continent's top coffee exporter, and the DRC, the world's biggest source of cobalt, to recover from a pandemic that has slashed jobs, household incomes, and pushed over 30 million people right across the continent into extreme poverty. The slow pace of vaccinations, where they are taking place, is also hampering recovery across sub-Saharan Africa. Let's explore the details on this story in more detail with Leon Senyange. He joins us now from Kampala. So, Leon, $1 billion is the amount that has been agreed to here. What will Uganda use it for?
Well, $1 billion, certainly one that will be welcomed by Uganda. And one particular reason here is that Uganda should be using this amount of money to pick itself up from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. This certainly was a global phenomenon, affected every country just across the world, and Uganda definitely was no exception. Uganda announced its first case in March 2020, and lockdown thereafter followed, and many things actually were shut down. Businesses, schools, factories, entertainment centers. Nobody was able to go to work. Several people lost their jobs. The tourism took a very steep drop. And even with the possibility of recovery later on, several months on, around October and September, it's been a really, really slow curve. And suddenly, Uganda at this point in time needs all the kind of resources to try and pick itself up from what has been a very, very difficult period.
According to the fund, Uganda will also be focusing on being able to fund larger and larger portions of its public spending from its own tax revenues. But do we know what sort of targets the finance ministry has as far as raising taxes is concerned?
Well, the targets are certainly the kind that fall in a time that is very difficult, like I said earlier. But this year, and presumably very, very soon, Uganda will be reading out its budget that falls in about $13 billion. And much of that will, of course, come from the domestic revenue. The lesser part from and approximately 23%, they are coming through from external funding. There have also been ideas on the possibility of increasing taxes here and there, possible areas coming through from mobile money transactions, internet data, and also rental incomes. That, of course, are some of the areas where the government wants to generate some of its revenue. But also, and importantly, is that there's been the idea of trying to increase taxes on fuel. It's a suggestion that many economic experts have said is entirely wrong, because Uganda's economy is importantly driven by fuel and the price of gas. So any possibility of a tax increase in that particular area will, of course, directly mean the increase in costs of goods and services. So the figures are definitely fall between about $13 billion, but it's quite a tall order at this point in time.
Indeed, and of course, at this point in time, oil prices have gone up by almost 40% in the first 5 months of the year. The finance minister, though, had floated this idea earlier in the year of a debt service break from some of the country's creditors. Has there been any movement in securing that debt service break, or is that still being negotiated?
Well, like you say, the minister had mooted that kind of idea. About a month ago, it's something that was put on table. And, of course, the negotiations were between Uganda and its major creditors, who are China, and also the World Bank, on the possibility of a possible break, if not still a suspension of the debt. It's not yet clear how further the negotiations have gone, and whether they've actually even started, or even still at that. But it's also still going to be another kind of tall order, given the fact that Uganda's debt stands at approximately $18 billion. The economists say that this, of course, is unsustainable, given the fact that it is beyond the 50% threshold. So definitely the possibilities of having a break, or even still a suspension on that, is one that may take very much a long discussion.
All right, one last question for you. So Uganda's next budget, the one that the finance minister will be talking about in another week or so, that has also debt service costs taking up over 90% of available tax revenues, which are forecasted around $5.88 billion by the finance ministries. You've probably alluded to this a little before, but who are the top creditors to whom most of this debt service costs will go?
Well, Uganda quite has a number of creditors there, and probably just to rank for you in the top 5, maybe top 6, we have China through the Exim Bank. We have the International Development Association, which is also part of the World Bank. They come out and help some of the world's poorest countries. We have the World Bank itself, the International Monetary Fund, and also the Africa Development Bank. Now, these rank among the top creditors for Uganda, for whom, well, much of the $18 billion in debt actually falls. So, yes, those are the entities that Uganda would definitely be wanting to pay back money to.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Leon Sanyanga there in Kampala. Now then, into the business of aviation, air passengers in Algeria are struggling to cope with high ticket prices. The North African state recently eased pandemic restrictions, and that did see the partial return of international travel. While new arrivals into the country still have to get into quarantine despite being required to provide a negative result from a COVID PCR test before they fly in, many Algerians see the resumption of international travel as a step towards economic recovery. Here's CGTN's Alexandre Majala with that story.
Algeria is easing border restrictions with a return of some international flights on June 1st. The move follows months of closure due to the coronavirus pandemic. Passengers returning to the country are required to present a negative COVID-19 test taken less than 36 hours before boarding, but are also required to quarantine in a hotel on arrival for 5 days.
Why should we stay 5 days in quarantine with a negative PCR test? That doesn't even happen in France or other European countries. It's too much.
Algeria's borders have been mostly closed since the global pandemic struck in early 2020. Authorities only reopened them to humanitarian flights from France between January and March this year, before another wave of infections began. This left thousands who are working overseas marooned, separating families with dual nationality but helping to protect against a more serious infection rate.
Today is the first day of the return of commercial flights, and the first destination is Paris. You attended the passenger check-in, and we are doing all the formalities to leave. Therefore, for departures, they must complete the formalities required by the host country for all passengers leaving Algeria. On the other hand, we have our own requirements for us in Algeria for all passengers regardless of who arrives in the country, according to the requirements from the first day.
In total, Algeria has registered 126,000 coronavirus cases and 3,300 deaths. The North African state has reopened its borders to flights from France, Tunisia, Spain and Turkey, but not to Gulf states where many Algerians also live and work. For thousands of Algerians stuck abroad, the government's decision to partially reopen is a relief. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
All right, then a quick run now through some company headlines. Let's start in Nigeria. Ketron Investment Limited has acquired ShopRite Nigeria from the retail supermarket Nigeria Limited. That's the owner and the operator of the ShopRite stores in Nigeria. Ketron is owned by a group of institutional investors. The divestment effectively by ShopRite International after 16 years in a West African oil and gas exporter is pretty much in line with its strategy to change from an ownership model to a franchise model. The East African insurance group Britam has sold an additional 20.1 million shares of Equity Group with a market value of about $7.9 million. That effectively cuts its ownership in the country's most profitable lender to a new low of 6.77% in the year ending in December 2020. Now, Britam did hold 275.7 million shares of Equity Bank at the end of 2019, but it's been slowly reducing the concentration of its investment in the institution, which often represents more than 10% of its total assets. A Standard Chartered unit intends to set up a cryptocurrency brokerage and exchange platform in the UK and Europe targeting institutional clients. And the move from Asia, Africa, Middle East focused Standard Chartered is one of the strongest endorsements yet from a mainstream lender for cryptocurrencies, as global banks continue to juggle clients' interests in these digital assets with concerns about their risks and a somewhat uncertain regulatory future. And finally, Zoom sales have more than doubled after a very strong start to the year as the COVID-19 pandemic still continues. The video calls platform saw explosive user growth during the crisis as many companies have opted to have some or all of their employees work remotely, either full-time or part-time. Zoom reported earnings of over $227 million, up from about $27 million in the first quarter of 2020. But analysts previously said the firm would face a bit of a battle to remain relevant as more people get vaccinated in Western economies and pandemic restrictions, including social distancing, continue to ease. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's on the other side. The volume of mobile money transfers in Tanzania goes up to $73 billion. And the IMF is set to release the final tranche of a $5.2 billion loan for Egypt.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this. But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome welcome back to the program. Back into East Africa for our next story. The value of mobile money transactions in Tanzania hit $73 billion in the 9 months to April 2021. Tanzania's Communications Regulatory Authority reported a rise of 8.4% in the number of registered SIM cards over that period. The number of mobile money service users went up by nearly 21% to 32.7 million. Here's Daniel Kijo with the data from Dar es Salaam.
Snow Cream is Tanzania's oldest ice cream franchise, a family business that started in 1961. Although the flavors have remained the same, the way the business is run has changed drastically. The managing director, Mariam, has transformed a cash payment-based business into a cashless mobile money payment system. She started taking mobile money payments 3 years ago and says now it makes up about 30% of their transactions.
The reason why we prefer mobile money payments and we hope it continues to rise is a number of things, from security, from not having to use cash all the time or move cash around. We're able to make various vendor payments and supply payments through mobile money. We have complete access to it at any time, send it directly to the bank, removing those little obstacles of having to handle cash all the time.
Mariam is just one of the millions of Tanzanians who use mobile money on a day-to-day basis. The $73 billion in transactions over the last 9 months is the highest on record for the country. The chairman of Tanzania's Association of Mobile Operators says mobile money transactions are key for economic growth.
We have over 32% of the GDP is actually going through the mobile money platforms, which means that it is significant to the economy.
According to the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, Tanzania sees 300 million mobile money device transactions worth $5 billion every month. This earned the government about $35 million a month in fees and taxes. Over the past decade, mobile money services have evolved from providing remittance services to fully fledged financial services. They now offer microloans, insurance, utility payments, mobile banking, international payments, government payments, and even merchant payments. Vodacom's M-Pesa remains the market leader and has over 10 million users and 150,000 agents nationwide. The team is looking to push mobile money usage even further by creating innovations that allow businesses to embed a payment feature in their service without having to physically meet the Vodacom team.
We enable all the financial technology innovators in Tanzania to connect into our system in a blink. They don't need to, come and do meetings with us and all these things. They have an open API, they can connect to our platform, and they can start their own businesses. And we believe that this vehicle will definitely enhance and grow the mobile money transactions even further.
Telecom experts say the huge sums involved in mobile money transactions are a clear indication that Tanzania's economy is rapidly moving to a cashless, or at least a less cash economy. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
Up north, Egyptian authorities expect to receive the final tranche of a $5.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund before the end of June. That tranche is valued at $1.6 billion. Yasser Hakim has the details on Egypt's performance under this 12-month program.
In its report, the International Monetary Fund said the Egyptian government has succeeded in achieving the program's goals of maintaining economic stability during the pandemic, without jeopardizing expenditure on social welfare programs and health services, as well as keeping in line with agreed structural reforms.
The loan has many benefits. We know that Egypt has a reform plan with the IMF and has implemented it with success, proven by the way the economy sustained itself against the effects of the pandemic. There are specific sectors that will pump foreign currency into the market if they recover quickly, like tourism and exports, as well as increasing energy production. The revenue will help the government reduce its dependence on external debt, as advised by the IMF.
The arrangement opens the door for the release of $1.6 billion, the final tranche of a $5.2 billion emergency loan to support the government throughout the pandemic. In May 2020, Egypt received $2.77 billion from the International Monetary Fund. which represents the value of the rapid credit financing granted to the Egyptian government.
The areas of expenditure will go towards continuing the infrastructure projects like roads, hospitals and schools, which are at different stages of development. The aim is to improve living conditions for the citizens. The IMF has forecast by 2023, growth rates will return to pre-COVID levels.
The North African nation's government says the IMF review would positively reflect on the inflow of investments, reduce debt levels, narrow the budget deficit, as well as create more job opportunities. Yes Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Now on to West Africa. The state-owned Nigeria National Petroleum Corporation, or NNPC as it's more commonly known, is looking to buy a 20% stake in Africa's biggest refinery project. The commissioning of the Dangote refinery is expected to start sometime in early 2022. As CGTN's Deji Badmus now explores, the refinery is critical for Nigeria. Despite being the continent's biggest single crude oil exporter, it has to import virtually all the fuel used in the country since the 4 state-owned refineries are not operational.
Reputed to be Africa's biggest oil refining facility and the world's largest single-train plant with a 650,000 barrels per day capacity, the Dangote refinery is nearing completion and expected to begin operations next year. It's one of the 6 private refineries being built that the government-owned NNPC has expressed interest in acquiring minority equity stake in. The NNPC says the move is in line with government policy, which stipulates the mandatory participation of the state's oil firm in any privately owned refinery that exceeds 50,000 barrels per day capacity, so as to safeguard national energy security. The plan has raised eyebrows, but experts say it may not be out of place, calling instead for transparency in the entire process.
The first thing we need to look at is for the deciders, in which case the government and the NNPC, to let us know the parameters with which they decided that they wanted to invest in Dangote. The second part of it is that how is this investment different from other PPP investments, public-private partnerships? And then we need to understand if they are similar, why are the requisite authorities not involved?
It's a welcome development because whether you like it or not, what they're going to be producing there is something that the nation will need for a very long time. So a strategic asset like that in a nation where you predominantly depend so much on petroleum products, I think is a wise decision for the Nigerian Petroleum Corporation to invest or buy up some shares, buy up some stakes in that business. So they too can also, it will help them, stay in the decision-making structure of that transaction or that plant.
In March, the government approved the sum of $1.5 billion for the immediate rehabilitation of its 4 refineries, which have been grounded for several years. The move to acquire stakes in private-owned refineries has raised concerns about the rehabilitation process of the government-owned refineries.
I think I will also prefer to advise, personally as an individual, that the Nigerian government and NNPC should focus more on revamping our own national-owned refineries. That is how national governments do, whether it is in China or in Korea or in Brazil or anywhere. They should be more interested in fixing their national assets.
Despite being Africa's biggest oil producer, Nigeria imports virtually all the refined petrol consumed in the country, costing the government over $300 million in monthly subsidy. The Dangote refinery is expected to address the problem and transform the country into an exporter of refined petrol. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
The World No Tobacco Day is observed by creating awareness about the dangers of smoking. Yasser Hakim examines the situation in Egypt, a country that still has a relatively high rate of smoking.
Official statistics show that in 2019, more than 17% of Egyptians above the age of 15 were smokers. That's about 11 million people. Another 30% were indirect smokers. What's more alarming is that these numbers have increased by 10% every year.
From our work, we noticed that smokers are from every age group and every social segment of the Egyptian population.
This is attributed to the daily economic and social pressures on people, whether laborers or well-educated segments. Also, the lack of awareness about the dangers of smoking on the heart, lungs, digestive system or cancer. Some take it as a social image, especially with women. That is why we have seen more women smokers.
The price of cigarettes has tripled over the last 4 years due to higher taxes on tobacco, yet this has not led to a drop in the number of smokers across Egypt.
It depends on workload on the day, but I smoke an average packet and half per day. The price increased, but I still smoke the same amount. It is in my blood, the nicotine, so really I'm not able to quit smoking. I have to buy it and smoke regardless of the price.
I only smoke less than a packet every day because I have problems in my chest. The government raised prices to force us to quit smoking, but I can't quit. I'm smoking less. The packet stays with me for a day and a half now.
Shisha or hookah has also compounded the situation, with a growing number hooked to it. More females in particular. The government has been taking several measures. For instance, it has placed warning signs on cigarette packets, prevented smoking in closed facilities like airports and banks, and completely banned hookahs since the coronavirus outbreak. However, experts say more efforts are needed.
I was very happy with the government's initiative called Quit Smoking. It is a free hotline service where you get consultancy from medical experts on how to quit smoking. But the state must be more involved by applying more stringent penalties on smoking in public places, banning any commercials for cigarettes, and more aggressive awareness campaigns targeting the youth in particular. Unfortunately, actors are seen smoking in movies and in TV series. They are role models, and this attitude destroys the awareness campaigns and should be stopped.
At a time when the coronavirus pandemic is taking its toll, health authorities have warned that smokers have a 50% higher risk of dying from COVID-19 complications than non-smokers. It's a message they hope many Egyptians will take seriously. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
You're watching Global Business Africa. It's time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. For the first time since 2018, inflation in the Eurozone goes above the ECB's target. And the new OECD chief pledges to focus on climate change during his time in office.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Ucheo Koronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's focus on the business of inflation. Headline inflation in the Eurozone rose sharply last month to 2%, just above the ECB's target range. Prices were pushed higher by a very strong rise in energy prices compared to a year ago, and they put inflation at its highest level effectively since October 2018. Now, this comes as COVID restrictions across the bloc were scaled back somewhat, boosting economic activity. The figure plays into a debate that's been raging for months now about whether inflation after the pandemic could become a serious problem. For much of the last decade, central banks across the developed world, from Japan to the US to the ECB, they've all been worrying that inflation is paradoxically too low. Now, as economies are recovering from the pandemic-driven downturn, inflation is going up. For the Eurozone, the European Central Bank has a target of below but close to 2%. All right, then, so let's examine this in a bit more detail. Emma McCarthy joins us now from London to help us pass the data coming from the Eurozone. So let's start with the tax side of things first, because some EU member states are posing this idea of having a global minimum level for corporate income tax at 21% or whatever number is eventually agreed to. But what sort of tax losses might be incurred if we do have a global minimum corporate income tax rate?
Ramah, good evening to you. Well, the United States is now pushing for a 15% rate, which is revised down from its original proposal of 21%. And it all comes as G7 finance ministers are set to meet in Britain on Friday, where they're expected to declare their support for this global agreement to address billions of dollars in lost tax revenue. And this push is backed by some large investors who are scrutinising tax bills as well as profits. Research by the charity Action Aid International estimates that taxing Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Alphabet and Microsoft fairly on their 2020 profits could potentially generate $32 billion for G20 countries, while a 2018 academic study found global state coffers lose out on $200 billion a year.
Okay, so low tax jurisdictions like Ireland, for example, they could, in theory, torpedo any bloc-wide efforts to agree on a minimum CIT rate, couldn't there? I mean, are there any policy changes that may make the idea more palatable to countries that are opposed to the idea, if on nothing else, on grounds of sovereignty?
Absolutely. Well, Ireland has led opposition to this agreement on the minimum tax, which puts Finance Minister Paschal Donohoe in a particularly interesting situation, considering that he's also the current president of the Eurogroup of finance ministers, many of whom actually support a deal. So Ireland's current corporate tax rate is 12.5% and has drawn criticism for a loophole that allows global technology companies to set up in the country, then avoid booking any profits made elsewhere in Europe. And the EU has tried to force Ireland to collect these taxes, but it's so far failed in the courts. Most famously, Apple is so far off the hook for its €13 billion tax bill. But can Ireland block an agreement? That's pretty hard to say, but with allies like the US feeling like they've already compromised by lowering the minimum rate, Dublin has less room to manoeuvre.
Indeed. Let's move on to the business of inflation. Central bankers on your side of the world, they've been long concerned about low inflation. But given that this is just the third consecutive rise in annual inflation that we're seeing across the Eurozone, can this be legitimately seen as a sustained long-term trend?
Well, as we know, as you've said, the Eurozone inflation surged past the European Central Bank's target in May. Inflation in those 19 countries that use the euro accelerated to 2% in May from 1.6% in April, to its fastest rate since the late 2018 and above the ECB's aim. And that was largely driven by higher energy costs. And that figure's also above expectations of 1.9%, which we saw in a Reuters poll. And it will likely intensify talk that structural forces, not just transient factors, may be behind that surge. And May is unlikely to be the peak. Inflation could be closer to 2.5% later in the year as the recovery from the pandemic-induced double-dip recession and recent commodity price increases add to price pressures. Still, though, getting through this period is more of a communications exercise for the ECB. The bank has already made it clear that this is not the sort of inflation it's looking for after nearly a decade of undershooting its target. So policy will remain loose for years to come, Ramah.
Indeed. So, and you've partially answered my next question, because the bulk of these rises in inflation really are being driven by energy prices. Brent has gone over $71 a barrel yesterday and in today's session. But given the transitory nature of energy price changes, does this really change anything for the ECB when they meet next week to review monetary policy?
Well, higher oil prices also mask weak underlying trends in inflation for goods and services. So core inflation only picked up to 0.9% from 0.8%. And ECB policy is also ineffective against short-term price movements, which is yet another reason for the bank to look past this year's surge. And all this supports arguments for the ECB to keep policy ultra easy when rate setters meet on June 10th. Even if they face a potential public backlash, especially in Germany, where inflation is set to exceed 3% later this year, as a tax hike and statistical pressures add to price pressures. Ramah?
Indeed, that fight between the ECB and the Bundesbank is always going to be interesting to watch out for. Emma McCarthy in London, thank you. Now, the former Australian Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, has become the head of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, as it's more commonly known. He's kicking off the job with a pledge to keep that global body focused on the fight against climate change. Cormann, whose nomination back in March was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph of sorts for Australia, served as Finance Minister for 7 years until late 2020 in a range of governments. But his campaign for that position did run into fierce resistance from top environmental groups, all of whom criticised his record in successive climate-skeptic Australian cabinets. Cormann pointed out that the OECD's International Programme for Action on Climate is essentially a new tool to evaluate members' efforts to reduce emissions, and it's a key part, he says, of the organisation's contributions.
We are faced with a formidably tall order to rebuild from the COVID-19 crisis, the worst health, economic and social crisis in the 60-year history of the OECD. The prospects are improving, certainly across the OECD, but the recovery remains uneven. We now project global GDP growth at 5.8% this year against COVID, of course. I mean, it's in everyone's interest to go flat out, to vaccinate, to maximize vaccinations all around the world. This is not a matter of benevolence or charity from advanced economies. This is a matter of making sure that we ultimately provide the greatest possible protection to all around the world, and indeed that we ensure that we have the best prospects of a sustained recovery.
Senior Chinese and US officials say that the country's economic relations are still very important. China's Vice Premier and Chief Trade Negotiator Liu He spoke via video link this morning with the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. According to the Xinhua news agency, they discussed the macroeconomic situation between the two economies, the two largest in the world, extensively. They also focused on multilateral and bilateral cooperation, and they agreed to keep communications lines open. Last week, Liu He spoke with the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai. It was the first time that the top trade negotiators from both sides had formally spoken since the U.S. President, Joe Biden, took office. Elsewhere, India's economy contracted by 7.3% in the fiscal year of 2020-2021. That is the worst recession on record for India. Though this, paradoxically, was better than expected, the current surge in COVID-19 cases in the country is threatening a broader recovery, as CGTN's Ravinder Bauer now explains.
Well, the numbers are much better than many estimates made by the experts, and the main Three sectors which have contributed in the growth are construction, manufacturing and utilities. These sectors have shown more growth than expected and given a final boost to the numbers. It clearly is private sector-led effort that has pulled up and contributed significantly. The services sector has not contributed. The contact-based services have been at a standstill due to lockdown across the country, and also the fear factor is keeping consumers away. One surprise has been the private consumption, which has registered low growth. It has contracted for the quarter at 2.6% and for the full year has contracted by 10%. Private consumption is not showing promise just yet and the government will have to boost it. Clearly, with lockdowns, there have been job losses leading to higher unemployment, and we are seeing its impact on consumption. With business being impacted and millions out of work, expenditure has also gone down. India also revised its annual GDP estimates for the fiscal year, predicting a 7.3 contraction, less than its earlier estimates of about minus 8%. Remember, the economy witnessed a massive contraction of 24.4% in the first quarter amid COVID-19 pandemic-led nationwide lockdown. The country exited the technical recession phase when GDP growth improved to 0.4% in October-December quarter of 2021. Well, the experts say that these numbers might not mean much after 6 months, and at the end of 21-22, India will see a higher growth. But all this will depend on a successful vaccination drive, which is slow at the moment, with only a little over 4% of the population vaccinated. Ravinder Baba, CGTN, Ranchi.
On to Germany now. The country's downgraded its coronavirus risk level on Tuesday, but health ministry officials have a new problem to worry about. There are concerns about possible financial fraud from coronavirus testing. In some places, the number of tests given doesn't line up with the expensive bill that the government is getting. Essentially, there are fears that some private companies behind these centres are basically ripping off the German taxpayer. Ian Thompson has this report from Frankfurt.
After more than 6 months in lockdown, nearly all of Germany is reopening. But getting back to normal here is strictly guided by testing. No negative swab from the last 24 hours means no dining and no shopping. To make it easier, every resident is entitled to 1 free rapid test per week. The government pays private operators to do it at about $22 per swab. But as more Germans are getting tested, there are new fears about possible fraud, and government officials say the numbers don't always add up.
There
is a suspicion, a well-founded one as far as I can see, of fraud with criminal intent at some testing stations. Fraud is a disgrace, and prosecutors are on the case.
Over the weekend, German media reported that the rapid test process was out of control, with few federal states even knowing how many citizen tests are taking place. That's despite the fact that the costs to Germany's 16 states are quickly rising. The same report also investigated newly opened testing centers in North Rhine-Westphalia. At one, 977 tests were billed to the government, but journalists there only counted 80 people. But healthcare privacy rules are not on the government's side in this case. Test centers are not allowed to disclose the names of the people who have visited, and on top of that, they don't even have to provide receipts to prove they've purchased all of the tests that they say they've given. Political commentators note this is not the first time the government has been in hot water.
First of all, it's another failure of the crisis management of the government. And it's not only about fraud, it's only about public health, because some of the test stations did not perform the tests in the right way.
With testing so essential to reopening, how can they crack down on this?
The government really needs to say now who is in charge of doing the control of the individual test stations. And it's not that easy to find the right body for that, because we have public health administrations in the different regions, but they're very busy with the other tasks related to the pandemic, and they actually are overwhelmed with work already.
Those regional health officials met with the federal government in Berlin Monday. And though nothing firm was decided, people at the meeting say it's likely that tax authorities will be taking a closer look at some of the company's books. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
On to Italy, where the country has further eased pandemic restrictions with the first low-risk, so-called white zones reinstated for the first time since the start of the year. Across the country, diners are now allowed to eat indoors, and the national nighttime curfew is set to be lifted. Hermione Kitson has the latest from Pescara.
Indoor dining has returned to the country, which takes its culinary expertise seriously. Restaurant owners say it means they're finally back in business.
It is a sign of relief after months of suffering, a rebirth and restart for us and our clients. I hope we can all come out stronger.
Another tradition reinstated, the Italian espresso at the bar.
It was a big pleasure to return to normal life as it was before.
As COVID restrictions ease, Italy is changing colour. Now 3 regions, including the island of Sardinia, are classified as low-risk white zones, where there's no curfew and closed businesses can reopen. All other regions are low to medium-risk yellow zones. The coastal city of Pescara was one of the first areas to be declared a red zone in the country's third wave of infection. Now it's also on the verge of becoming a white zone.
Finally, Pescara is the city that has the lowest contagion rate in Italy, when in February it had the highest infection rate. We worked well. We are preparing for an important summer because we're sure to fill our beaches with tourists.
The head of Italy's central bank says the country's economy could grow 4% this year, a positive forecast on the first official day of the summer season. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Pescara.
Tech has the ability to improve lives significantly, and that's particularly true for persons with disabilities and special needs. Tonight, let's take you to Egypt, where a prototype pair of eyeglasses is making the world a lot more accessible for the hearing impaired. Here's CGTN's Mahia Muto with that report on what's hot tonight.
It is a common misconception that most hearing impaired people can easily read lips. While many are indeed practiced lip readers, the skill is not always accurate and can at times be difficult, especially in cases where the speaker has a thick accent or mumbles a lot. A number of recent technological innovations have over the years attempted to address this issue, from devices that turn spoken language into text on a smartphone to smart glasses like this Egyptian prototype designed by 26-year-old Omar Abdel Salam that can translate voices into sign language.
The idea is for a hearing impaired person to wear them, and when someone speaks to them, they can press a button which then translates people's voices to sign language, which appears on a screen in front of the eye. But even though this screen is very close to the eye, the user will see the image at a distance of over 50 centimeters from the eye, so it does not affect eyesight.
Hi, my name is Omar.
So how does this technology work? Well, a small camera fixed on the device picks up on voice signals from the speaker. It then uses artificial intelligence to translate the words in real time into sign language for the wearer on a small built-in screen. Similarly, if the user wants to read a book, the glasses use augmented reality to capture the image on the page and again translate it into sign language. Abdel Salam's design has over the past 6 years developed from merely a mobile application to what is available today.
The glasses are great and I'm very happy with them because I believe that they can help us and allow us to communicate with a lot of people.
The engineering student based the design on a few products available in the United States. However, limited resources mean the prototype is handmade and not ready for production.
During the past 6 years, I've developed the glasses from a mobile application to various models until the one you see today that translates English voice and text to sign language, but only a limited number of signs. In order for me to reach my final product, I need to translate Arabic and colloquial Arabic. I need to embed all dictionaries into the glasses because the sign language differs from country to another and even from one governorate to another. I also want to work on the glasses so they are not handmade by us, but a final product straight from the factory and ready to use without any issues.
The next step for Abdel Salam's invention is to one day hit the market and improve the lives of those who need it most. Mahe Mutwa, CGTN.
Quick run through commodity prices. Brent crude and WTI, they just continue to build up on the gains from earlier on in the week when they broke through 2.5-year highs. 68.56 was the intraday high for WTI crude, spurred on by a fairly optimistic demand outlook, particularly in Western markets. The International Energy Agency, remember, has expressed concern about a growing gap between demand and supply, especially in the second half of the year. On paper, Iran could add a fair bit of supply to the market, but at this point, talks on getting the JCPOA back on track, they really haven't yielded results so far. That really is a wild card. Here's what's coming up next. Africa's leading designer and Nelson Mandela's tailor looks back on his career half a century on.
When you look at Africa, what do you really see? Do you see fast-growing, endless deserts and parched earth? Or do you see the biggest opportunity for an agricultural revolution in a generation? Do you see crowded, unplanned cities or vast, untapped markets? Do you see a population at risk? Or do you see a billion-strong opportunity to grow the next wave of multi-billion-dollar firms in Africa? When you look at Africa, what do you really see? Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. With a career spanning 5 decades, Pathio, as is popularly known, is one of Africa's leading designers. His richly coloured shirts have been worn by Nelson Mandela, the Moroccan monarch King Mohammed VI, Rwanda's President Paul Kagame, and the continent's richest man Aliko Dangote. Tonight, this is his story on Grassroots.
Ivorian Burkinabe tailor and fashion designer Pathio is looking back on a 50-year career that has seen him rise from self-taught improviser to a supplier of Africa's wealthy and powerful.
Yes, it is true that we got into this business to earn money. It's not fair that a continent like Africa doesn't even realize that fashion can be a part of Africa's wealth. We produce the best cotton in the world. But where is this cotton? As soon as it is picked, the cotton is gone.
As head of the pocket business empire that stretches across 10 countries and employs 60 people, the father of 3 still shows up every day at the workshop he first set up half a century ago in Abidjan's working-class district of Tracheville. Bit by bit he improved, starting to make a wider name for himself by winning the local Golden Scissors contest in 1987. 10 years later, South Africa's first black president and civil rights advocate Nelson Mandela wore one of his colored shirts at an official visit in France. The images prompted new customers, from Rwanda's President Paul Kagame to the continent's richest man, Aliko Dangote, to beat a path to his door.
No matter the experience, no matter the background, you still always have to work harder because this is a job in which you don't sleep. First of all, the designs, because everybody who comes in wants something new. Every day you have to create. So that means you have to always be there. You have to imagine, innovate, anticipate and change. That is what fashion is all about.
Pateo finds inspiration on the street, mostly from women who go to market decked in multicolored clothes and scarves.
He's a monument of African fashion, and I wanted to come and show him all this gratitude for this profession that he has chosen and one that he continues to please us with.
All the work at Pateo's workshop is done by hand on old cast iron Singer sewing machines. And as his business continues to flourish, Pateo says his next step is to pull all his success and international recognition behind what he calls the battle to win the respect of African fashion industry. Noel Makugu, CGTN.
Our last story is a little curious. Normally when you're talking about chronic pain, bee stings aren't usually the sort of solutions you're talking about. But that's essentially what you're going to see here in this story from Libya. Residents ailing from chronic illnesses over there are turning to bee stings for a treatment for pain relief. CGTN's Daniel Arab Moy has that story.
This is not a bee farm. It's a medical clinic in Libya's Misrata town. The health center treats their patients by stinging them with bees. A worker carefully plucks the honey bees out of a busy hive and places them in a plastic bag. He then hands the bees over to Mohammed Al-Zawawi, an apitherapy practitioner in Misrata town.
Bee sting treatment was not known in Libya. Only a few people knew about it. When we started, we only had a small number of patients. But when recoveries were recorded, people started to ask about this treatment. What is this bee sting treatment? And the more results were recorded, the more people came.
Mohammed believes live bee acupuncture therapy can support the treatment of a variety of diseases as well as relieve pain.
Bee sting treatment helps in reducing pain, which disappears after the second or third week. Bee sting treatment is known all over the world in apitherapy centers that were founded in various countries, such as Morocco.
In a typical session, Mohammed says he uses an average of 6 bees to sting different parts of his patients' bodies, depending on their ailments. His patients agree the bee stings have tremendously helped them in their journey to recovery.
In August 2019, I started treatment, and in July last year, I got rid of all my medications and continued with the bee stings. Thank God I am getting better. My insulin levels are close to normal. There is improvement in my vision and my blood pressure is excellent. I have no more high blood pressure.
My son has tumor. It was leukemia, but afterwards, it spread to his bones. We came to visit this doctor who uses bees, and thank God, there has been some improvement. His right eye had become swollen, but has since shown improvement. We hope that he gets well soon with the help of this doctor.
Apitherapy is considered as part of traditional medicine. It has been used for centuries in different parts of the world. Practitioners of live bee acupuncture claim the anti-inflammatory compound contained in the venom is beneficial to treat certain conditions. The practice, however, remains controversial within the medical field. Some say the health risk and side effects of administering venom to patients outweigh its purported benefits. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN.
All right then, bee stings wrapping up this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.